So Dr. Simon Hatherly is a sustainability architect and researcher and senior building performance architect supporting AHMM architects deliver net zero. So I think we're going to talk about guidance for architects, which is very much needed.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Today I'll be kind of touching on the toolkit that we're currently developing as another output from the KTP research, which I'll explain in a minute. I'll be talking about the Net Zero Carbon Guide, delivering net zero in use. And I'll kind of be touching on some of the learnings that have come since the publication of the guide in relation to kind of three themes: the role of standards, the whole life carbon performance gap, and different approaches to delivering net zero, some of which have already been touched on today. As I said, I'll be giving a bit of background on the KTP, talking about the research in the guide, the role of standards in driving net zero, the scope for a whole life carbon performance gap, approaches to delivering net zero, and the toolkit. So the kind of initiation of this is the KT Knowledge Transfer Partnership. It was a collaboration between AHMM and IEDE, and the main aim of the research was to develop approaches for delivering net zero and kind of looking specifically at large-scale net zero carbon projects. And the research was undertaken over the course of 2 years. It drew in lots of kind of different sources of information. It drew in some of the guides and standards that were published both in the run-up to the research, but also over the course of it. It incorporated modelling from AHMM's building performance team. We were fortunate that we had 4 MSc students who were able to contribute to the research as well. Some of their kind of findings I'll be touching on later. And also over the course of the research, we had a series of workshops with both architects and various consultants in order to kind of understand how the industry is adjusting to the challenge of delivering net zero carbon buildings. And of course, the final aspect to it was the inclusion of a case study. I've not included the case study in this presentation. Like all of this, I'd first of all recommend that you go out to AHMM's website and download the guide, where there's much more detail. As I said, the guide was published in September last year. It kind of outlines a whole life carbon approach to delivering net zero. It kind of outlines kind of 10 key points for delivering net zero and approaches that are things like a combination of processes, like incorporating the principles of efficiency and economy, utilizing the circular economy, understanding the role of the architect in delivering net zero carbon solutions. And perhaps one of the kind of significant parts about the guide that Sven touched on earlier was this, is that we did take a whole life carbon approach to defining net zero. And it's one that kind of recognizes that you've got this initial emissions at the start of the building, the upfront carbon, A1 to A5 at the start. You've got emissions over the life of the building from the operation of the building. This is both direct emissions from the burning of fossil fuels on site, but also things like indirect emissions from the electricity grid or other energy grids, and also the release of greenhouse gases on site from things like refrigerants. You've got the emissions at the end of the building's life from its deconstruction, and then you've kind of got opportunity to mitigation through material recovery. And of course, the most controversial aspect of this is the use of offsets, which wherever we try, you know, we should, as designers, we should kind of recognise that the riskiest part of this whole thing is the offsets at the end, and we endeavour to try and minimise those as much as possible. One of the other things that we kind of tried to bring out in the guide was this idea that it is a fundamental approach, change in approach to delivering buildings. And kind of one aspect to this was recognizing that that carbon and it's of an importance that in terms of a constraint, but also an opportunity in delivering buildings, that it kind of ranks alongside time, cost, and quality. And as such, with the kind of golden triangle that we often use to kind of identify these key constraints on the delivery of buildings, should now be redefined as a carbon square. One of the kind of starting points in the research was kind of looking at net zero carbon building standards and the way in which expert bodies, but also things like industry initiatives were kind of defining net zero, and part of that was to try and kind of bring a definition within the research itself. But as I said, kind of looking at what the ways in which these expert bodies were defining net zero. And we kind of looked at a range of international building standards. And one of the kind of interesting things to come out of this research was this kind of recognition that that there was kind of a fundamental shift in the way in which these organisations were responding to the delivery or the challenge of defining net zero. So, for example, a lot of the standards were based on in-use performance as opposed to predicted performance or the design. A lot of them had just a handful of key metrics. So as opposed to something like BREEAM, where you've got dozens of credits, instead this was kind of replaced by often 2 or 3 metrics, such as upfront embodied carbon or operational energy. And as I said, it kind of represented a kind of fundamental shift in the way that these standards were, these expert organisations were defining net zero. So on this side, you've kind of got the kind of existing environmental building standards, things like BREEAM and LEED. And on this side, you've got the net zero carbon standards, as I said, where they're often the requirements are based on in-use performance and this kind of really small, very focused number of assessment criteria. And it's one of the other kind of interesting things to kind of come out of this this analysis was the relationship of these standards to both international standards and national legislation. So it's kind of one of those things that's been touched on earlier today, the fact that that these kind of standards are almost filling a gap through the fact that through a lack of national legislation. But also it's kind of interesting to note that certainly when we think back to the implementation of other kind of environmental building standards, that where there's a lack of national regulation, it's often picked up by regional or municipal authorities. So, for example, local government, and that's we're starting to see the beginnings of that now, where, for example, Scottish government are kind of looking, have implemented their own net zero carbon standard for buildings, public buildings in Scotland, and also, for example, in London, the GLA have kind of introduced kind of assessment methods for things like whole life carbon. And I suppose one of the other kind of interesting things about this study was the fact that there was kind of 2 fundamentally different approaches to to kind of reaching to, for these standards to define or reach a net zero carbon kind of target. And the first was, well, this was probably the first. This is the bottom up, where you kind of go out to industry, you define what best practice is, you review industry's capacity to deliver demand reduction, and then you kind of introduce the offsets. And then the other is kind of a top-down approach, whereby you kind of look at a national carbon budget, and then you slice up that budget until you've kind of got an individual building left. And that's kind of the approach of something like PREM. And I suppose one of the interesting things is certainly about the UK net zero carbon building standard is that they're trying to combine those approaches and use both the top-down methodology and a bottom-up, and hopefully meet in the middle. But we'll just have to see how that works out. The other thing, kind of one of the other interesting aspects to come out of the research was this recognition of the whole life carbon, or the potential for a whole life carbon performance gap. When we kind of think about the performance gap, it's typically been applied to the operation of the building. But when we take a whole life carbon approach, I think we need to recognize that at each one of those steps, there is scope for a performance gap. So for example, in the embodied carbon, the upfront embodied carbon at the beginning, you've got scope for undercounting the embodied carbon that goes in. Of course, you've got the operational, but of course, each one of these kind of life cycle steps, where you've kind of got repair and refurbishment cycles, also has the potential for a performance gap. And you've also got the potential that the building will change use over time, again, affecting embodied carbon emissions, or life cycle embodied carbon emissions. And then at the end, you've got the potential for less material to be recovered than might be initially anticipated. In terms of offsets, you've got the potential for additionality, that is the additional contributions to the grid decarbonisation that you might be expected as part of a package of offsets to not provide that additionality. And then in terms of other types of kind of offsetting approach, so for example, biogenic storage, things like tree planting or soil management, you've got the risk of reversal or fire or any kind of, or changes of land management, all of which will kind of contribute to this kind of whole life carbon performance gap. And kind of one of the things that we tried to do at the over the course of the research was start to kind of capture some of these and quantify them. And this is kind of some of the work that was done by the MSc students, where they kind of looked at a whole life carbon assessment. And they took a building and they looked at, firstly, the databases that were used, but secondly, the kind of sources of volumetric information. So for example, whether the data, whether the kind of volumetric information had come from like the cost plan, the design stage data, or whether it was kind of pulled directly from the Revit model. And it's kind of interesting that, you know, the same building, but just drawing on these different sources of volumetric data, you get quite significant differences in the upfront embodied carbon. So right at the very start of this process, you're starting to see the beginnings of a performance gap. This chart, this is a waterfall diagram from one of the offices that that's in the office, and it's kind of significant because it's the first of projects where we've got subcontractor data on whole life carbon. And it's interesting because it presents a kind of positive picture, a picture whereby the at stage 5, the subcontractors have gone out and they've engaged with their supply chain, and over the course of the construction stage, they've managed to kind of pull down the upfront embodied carbon and make significant savings. I think what this doesn't say is all of the gaps that occurred and in that analysis. Unfortunately, it doesn't say how the data was, how some of the data might have been only for products or materials that had EPDs associated with them. It doesn't kind of outline how, for example, where there was kind of an increase in the carbon emissions associated with the project, how that was kind of investigated, but some of the decreases didn't have the same level of interrogation. Oh, sorry, skipped ahead. And kind of one of the other things that was examined over the course of the research was different approaches. I think this is kind of one of these things that was touched on in the morning session, that that there are that we kind of typically, when we think about net zero, we think of the kind of net zero now, the kind of an approach whereby buildings is considered net zero at or close to practical completion, but also it's also important to recognise that you will have more kind of pragmatic approaches that we call within the guide the pathways approach, and this is kind of where an asset will be kind of decarbonised over time. And again, this is something that we're starting to see in the office, that whilst the majority of the projects that we're kind of net zero carbon aspirational projects that we're kind of getting in, or we're seeing in AHMM, the client's looking for them to be net zero at the point of practical completion or near to practical completion. We're also seeing a few, particularly heritage projects, where they're kind of looking for this approach of decarbonisation over time. And they're both looking at this in terms of the kind of top down, but also in terms of like in relation to top down carbon budgets, or bottom up approaches, but also top down carbon budgets. And as I said, kind of we're looking. The next step is to kind of pull some of these learnings together and develop a net zero carbon toolkit. And one of the kind of key parts of the toolkit is that it will take that that diagram, the whole life carbon diagram, and it will pull in data from various sources from the consultants, and it will generate a visualization tool for the architects so they can see where the bulk of their emissions lie. It will also allow them to kind of track the emissions over the course of several kind of interventions so that those kind of changes in the whole life carbon can be tracked over the course of the project. It will also allow for some of the drivers to be interrogated. So recognise that actually, although we've kind of defined the carbon square, the reality is that on many projects it will distort in relation to key project drivers. And the tools that we're developing will allow those kind of drivers to be interrogated, and then we can see the kind of shape of the project in terms of its yeah, as I said, in terms of its project drivers. So.
Thank you so much, Simon.